All right, well, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 3 tonight. We are looking at the question, what went wrong? And I'm just going to read just a few key verses and we'll refer back to them in a second. I'm going to start in chapter 3, verse 1. And it says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will certainly not die,' the serpent said to the woman, 'for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' And when the woman saw the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. And the eyes of both of them were open. They realized that they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." And the rest of it will hit as we go along. Let's open in prayer. Father, thank you for the opportunity to share together in this time here in the building and also on video at our homes. And I just pray that your Holy Spirit would guide our conversations, that you would grow us, give us better understanding of relationships. Help us, Father, to function more fully in the original intent that you had for our relationships. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. A couple of things before we get going here. First of all, I just want to review. We started out first session with like 6 big questions, and we are on question number 5. Even though I didn't dedicate a specific session to each one of the 6 questions, I just want to review them real quickly so we know where we're at. The first question was, who am I? Which is the creation question, the identity question. I'm a child of God made in his image. That's out of Genesis 1 and 2. Second question is, why am I here? What's my purpose? I'm here to honor God. I'm here to enjoy his presence and fellowship, his friendship, and then to expand his orderly, caring rule, which kind of dovetails in with the third question is, what am I here to do? As the image of God, I'm here to represent him and to extend his rule, his compassionate rule, out into the wilds of creation and in my spheres of influence. Also, number 4, who am I working with? And this one we didn't really address in specific in a session, but it's the equality question. We've talked about it in several sessions, talking about the equality of man and woman. I'm working with others who are equally created in the image of God. No one is greater, no one's lesser. And when we looked at the marriage scenario from Genesis chapter 2 last week, it was very clear that God did not make woman lower than man and man higher. That was not the intended idea there. There's this great sense of equality. So gender, race, status distinctions that we tend to assign to other people to try and elevate ourselves above them or to diminish them have no value to God. They were not in his original plan. And that brings us to the 5th question, which is what went wrong? And we know, hey, here's this great intent, here's all this ideal stuff in Genesis chapter 2, in Genesis chapter 1, but from our experience, we know that we don't have that kind of ideal setting. We know that there's relational stress, we know there's divorce, we know there's heartache, we know there's death, we know there's all kinds of conflict and competition. Life doesn't look like it did in Genesis 1 and 2. We certainly know that. So, we have to look at it and go, okay, what went wrong? Why is the ideal broken? And how can we start moving back toward some semblance of that ideal? Because the ideal is really good. And so we want to go there in our relationships. So tonight we're going to take on that 5th of the big 6 questions, seeking to gain clarity through a more complete understanding of how things kind of went sideways in the garden. There are several questions that arise when we carefully read Genesis 3. And listen, Genesis 2 and 3 have been part of my study for almost a year now, and I absolutely love them. I'm learning stuff that I never understood about the creation story. And so a lot of that's tied into what we're doing here. We're going to ask these questions. Each answer gives us clarity into a broad meaning of the passage. So the first question that I have is, the answer is actually found in Genesis 3:1. Where does the serpent come from? Okay, so where does the serpent come from? Critical to answering several of the questions that are a part of our big 6. Where does the serpent come from? Okay, from the wilds. Absolutely. And that's important because, did I phrase that as a question? No, I didn't. Why is that important? Why is it important that the serpent came from outside the garden rather than inside the garden? The serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God made, so it implies that he's from outside. Why is that important? What do you think? Okay, yeah, so there's a different sense of limitation than we would tend to think would happen from the garden and what we know about life in the garden, certainly. Anything else you can think of? Why it's important that we know that he came from outside the garden? Where are they supposed to go? Where's their mission? Right? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, right? So the mission is outside the garden as well. So actually what's happening is Adam and Eve are living inside the garden, and their mission, actually, rather than them going outside, the mission comes to them. It's fascinating, isn't it? Go outside there, bring some order to this chaos. So we would tend to think that in creation, we tend to think that everything in creation was absolutely perfect, absolutely ordered. And the reality is everything in the garden was ideal and had this wonderful sense of the perfection, the idealism that we think of. But outside, why would God want them to go out there and bring his order there if there wasn't some sort of chaos out there, right? There's still a little bit of chaos going on in creation. So he wants them to join in, kind of like co-creating. So when God speaks, on the first day, let there be light, he's what? Bringing order out of chaos. Well, he creates man in his image to do the same thing, to kind of act as a co-creator. So the serpent comes from the wilds. It's absolutely critical for us to understand that, because there's a challenge that's going to happen inside the ordered garden that will kind of set up the what went wrong scenario, right? Second question is, what does this tell us about life outside the garden? Okay, so if the serpent comes from the wilds, what on earth is life like outside the garden, right? It's not the ideal, right? Yes, so there's a lack of structure, right? So life outside did not have the same structure as life inside the garden. And that's a really good way of looking at it, because when they go outside, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to bring the rule of God, because they're the image of God. They represent his rule. They're to bring the rule of God out there. They're to subdue it. They're supposed to rule over it, which means they're supposed to bring structure to it. And so that's one of the things that we kind of miss. Life outside the garden is treacherous. There are forces of chaos that still need some sort of taming. That's really what God says. Okay, go out there and tame the place. It's wild. So creation outside the garden still needs to be brought under the control of God. And the couple's identity, their moral compass, their mission are all on trial during the temptation. We tend to think of the temptation as, okay, it's going to get them to rebel against God. Yeah, it is. There's sin. We understand that. But there's this whole challenge of their identity as human beings that's going on at that point, that they really need at this point. And then I love this, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals that God created. Question that I had was, is crafty always a bad thing? Is that something that's always a negative quality, or can it sometimes serve us well?
It's part of creativity.
Yeah, it's part of creativity, right? Sometimes you have to think a little outside the box. Sometimes it's helpful to protect ourselves if we think wisely, or sometimes crafty is wise. Sometimes it leads to evil, and obviously here it leads to evil. But when we read that initially, it doesn't sink into us that this is an evil quality right off the bat until we get to like verse 3, right, where he starts the temptation in earnest and really begins to challenge them. It can be used for good. We obviously know that the serpent's ultimate use of it is evil and dark. It's not neutral. He's providing them the opportunity, and he's doing what? Tempting them to disobey. So his intent is evil, but it's not always an evil quality. Okay, so knowing that life outside the garden is wild or it's unstructured helps us better understand the nature of their mission, right? What's the core of their mission? First of all, the mission was never going to be easy. I think that's something that we misunderstand. Oh, Adam and Eve, they had this great life. They were just going to live it up in the garden their entire... No, they were to procreate, have children, and expand beyond the garden, and it wasn't going to be an easy thing. If this is the first wild animal they meet, right? This is going to be quite the task. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be straightforward. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be pretty messy. So this work image that we have kind of needs to be shaped differently. So it's not going to be easy. Having confidence in their identity as image bearers was vital to their survival as well as the advancement of God's order and rules. So when he comes in there and he starts questioning them, so the first thing that's the devil, the serpent does, he starts to question God and question them about their inner relationship with God. One of the big issues that he's dealing with really is their identity. Did God really say? We'll talk about that in a second, but what is he dealing with also? Well, you can be like God. So they needed to have confidence in who they were to face the struggles they were going to face on the outside of this thing. I'm an image bearer. And remember that image bearing idea is like Caesar stamping his image on a coin. Every time you picked up the coin, you remembered who was in charge. So the human being is like, I'm supposed to be in charge. I am the image of God here. And so their identity was under assault during the time of the temptation. And it implies also that they're going to need to instruct future generations, right? So they're supposed to have children, they're supposed to multiply, they're supposed to go outside the garden and have families, and those families are going to have families, and they're going to populate the earth that way. Adam and Eve needed to take what they knew about God and do what with it? You got to teach other people. You got to take responsibility for your family and pass that knowledge on to them so that they can handle the difficulties that they're going to experience in trying to tame nature and bring it under control. We talked about the fear of the Lord last week. They needed to pass on the instruction of the fear of the Lord, which is just simply accepting what God says as true and then living by it. Okay, so they needed to make sure that they were instructing the next generation, and that's part of the reasoning and how we're approaching like Christian Ed this year is, hey, we're going to get together, we're going to spend time in the video, we're going to spend time as family, and we're going to try and pass on this knowledge to our family and structure our families according to the will of God. Well, they would have had to have done the same thing. There was no church for them to go to. They were responsible. They were going to have to take that knowledge of God and pass it on. And the temptation, we know, had these far-reaching effects. It was sin, it was disregard for God, and it was a challenge to the core of their humanity. We get into verse 1. This is the did God really say? Did God really say that you should not eat from the trees of the garden? Whoa, nope. He said, and they came back with a great response. It was a moral challenge, trying to doubt, infuse a little doubt about God's authority, undermining the development of their own moral being, because remember, wisdom, knowledge, moral living comes from the fear of the Lord, accepting what God says and living it out. Did God really say is like, let me get your compass off a little bit. It's like taking a magnet and placing it next to a handheld compass. That question just started to draw Eve's moral compass off kilter just a little bit. So this is what the devil's trying to do. This is what the serpent is trying to do, trying to direct their attention away from God and challenge their moral development that only happens when you say, well, God's truthful, God is the one who we trust, therefore we're going to do what he says. Trying to do that. The second one is that in verse 5, you will be like God. Right? And that is a clear challenge to their identities. You are the image of God. You are created in the image of God, but you are not God. And so Satan is trying to develop this sense of you can be equal with or equal to the one who created you. So there's this challenge to their identity. And we know that in many ways they were already like God. They had the authority to rule. They had, hey, we're going to be co-creators with God. We're going to bring his order everywhere we go. They had all these wonderful qualities, but they were not to have the same knowledge capacity as God had. That could only happen, they could only grow in knowledge as they related to the one who has all knowledge, right? So there's this whole kind of crazy thing of challenge going on here. Satan is promising equality with God to know good and evil. Well, it's just a shortcut to divinity. You'll know like God knows. So you can be just exactly like him. Why do you think it's important at this juncture? I put it in my notes, necessary. Why do you think it's necessary to test the couple in this way? I mean, they've not been tested at this point, right? Why is it so important for them to be tested at this moment? What do you think?
I think he wants to determine their level of commitment and love.
Okay, so there is a question of commitment and love, and that is a big part of this. Are they really going to do it, and do they really love me? Fair. What else? Anything else you can think of why they need to be tested? I mean, I'm just thinking, this would be devastating, wouldn't it? You're in the garden, you're living it up, you're having a great time with God and with each other, and then all of a sudden, we have choices to make, right? Kind of scary. So, yeah, commitment, what else? Anything? How viable is their love for God if they don't have a challenge to it? Right? Is it real if it's not questioned or challenged? Is their commitment real if it's not challenged? They have to be able to make the choice. We are going to serve God. We are going to love God on our own. Not just because He's given us this great garden and He's given us this wonderfully secure life. They needed to be free moral agents. Because, I mean, God could have created an entire universe of beings that loved Him just because He made them love Him. I would much rather have somebody choose to love me than be made to love me, right? It's a big difference, huge difference in that. So they needed the opportunity to prove their capacity to obey God. They needed to serve and love Him willingly and freely. And of course, you know, this little episode has far-reaching impact on all of our human relationships. We're going to get into that now. It's not just, oh, wow, there's sin and now we have all these negative consequences, but now we have this relational impact that we experience constantly, almost on a daily basis. So what are the impacts on our relationships? Let's look at that. First of all, let's look at how this impacts our relationship with God. It impacts our relationship with God. So they rebel. What happens to their relationship with God when they choose to do the one thing that God has told them not to do? Right? You have one thing to guide your moral compass. Don't eat of this tree. Oh, it's really not that bad. It looks great. The serpent talked us into it. How does that change the nature of their relationship with God? What do you think?
Well, they broke a trust.
Yes, absolutely. They broke a trust. So trust is broken. What else? That's a huge part of this. God entrusted them the garden. He entrusted them creation, and they proved in that one instance, not so trustworthy, right? What else? What do you think?
Shows their integrity,
In what way?
whether or not they want to continue on or they want to support what God wants them to do.
Yeah, there's a sense in which the idea of integrity is their integrity is challenged, and then they have to determine, are we going to motor on, right? Are we going to follow through with this once we get through the whole negative emotion and disappointment that comes with the fallout? And that's a big part of this. Verse 8, it's interesting. Now they fear God, right? Not in the right way, not in the moral development way, not in the, oh, God said this, we're going to do it way, but in the, oh, we realized that we were naked and we hid from you way. Like, wait a minute, shame, guilt, all these negative emotions settle in and they hide rather than have this beautiful open relationship with the Father. And so that's a big part of what's going on here too. And they were afraid because they had directly disobeyed. And their eyes were open. They gained all kinds of knowledge all of a sudden, but it wasn't so great. After, the sales pitch was better than the product itself, I think is how that kind of works out, right? And we see that happen all the time in our society. Sales pitch is great, product, not so much. You're going to gain knowledge like God has. Well, now we feel lousy. Oh, yeah, great sales pitch. So, and the other thing that we have to remember from last week, when it says that they were naked and all of a sudden they were afraid of God in the sense of terror, that term naked doesn't necessarily, especially in a biblical sense, doesn't necessarily just mean unclothed. It means that they were, what do I say? Naked means vulnerability, it means poverty, it means oppression, it means injustice. There's a variety, this really broad statement when you look at it throughout the Old Testament. And so all of a sudden they were experiencing these negative emotions and insecurities that they had never experienced before. Fear, shame, embarrassment, guilt. They were insecure for the very first time, ever. We're not sure what's going to happen now. And so that really is the essence of the term naked in this case. So the relationship with God upended. Our relationship with each other is upended too. And that's really clear in this. My first question in this passage about the human relationships is always, where was Adam during the temptation? Right? Where was Adam during the temptation? So we have this relationship with God, and then we have this each other. That was in chapter 2. Yeah. You're close. Where was he? He's standing right there, right? And so we have this terrible image of, here's Eve interacting with the serpent, and verse 6 says that he was right there with her. And he didn't say a thing. Not one thing. And you pause there for a second. It says, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. She's like, doesn't taste too bad. Here, have some, right? Like, what did we just do? Dr. Larry Crabb, Christian psychologist, has a wonderful book called The Silence of Adam. You don't even have to read the book to know what it's about, right? Men. Silence of Adam. It pretty much says it all. Where's the responsibility? You're standing there. You didn't say anything. You didn't interject into the conversation. There he is. He was with her. He was right there witnessing the entire thing, and he remained silent. And then we have to begin to think, why did he remain silent? What does his silence indicate? There's a vacuum of leadership as we would know it from this side of the Genesis 3 experience, certainly. But I don't think either of them had really a context for the challenge that they were facing. And so I don't know if he really completely understood how to process it, other than he knew, no, we don't eat the fruit, and he didn't say a word. And it's a shame. It really is. He said, yes, dear. The earliest iteration of the most horrible statement on the face of the earth. Yes, dear. Right? Way to go, Adam. Thank you for your support in that, starting us off on the right foot. So then the next question is, how does the fall impact the marriage relationship? Because that's the first relationship that it impacts, right? And it's obviously going to impact all the other relationships. As we go from like Genesis 3 out to 11, if you continue reading, it affects every form of relationship. I mean, siblings hate each other. We see that whole thing. And then societies begin to hate each other and do crazy things as you go toward 11. But the marriage relationship is the first one. And I find it interesting that when God shows up in the garden, right, it's not like God didn't know what was happening. He didn't know, he couldn't premeditate this experience. Of course he knew it was going to happen. But he shows up, and I love kind of the nonchalant, like, where are you? He knows everything. Of course he knows where he's at. He just wants the admission, right? And you get down to verse 12. 11 and 12, and he said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? Of course, God knows this. And the man said, yes, Lord, I know I ate from the tree. I own it. Of course not. The first thing that he does is he places blame. Yeah, the woman, well, let's go here first. The woman that you gave me. So he starts out by blaming God. You're the one who, everything was cool in the garden until you did this. You messed this up so bad, God. Look what you did. Like, what? And of course, at the same time, he says, the woman, right, that you gave me. And then the woman does what? So Adam says, okay, God, you, the woman says, the serpent did it. The devil made me do it. And the serpent's like, nobody else to blame, right? This is the end of the road right here. Okay, I'll take it on the chin, I guess. Exactly. I didn't make her do that. I was just kind of being crafty, you made me this way. So there's nobody else to blame. But this is the first thing. Everything was okay until you put her here. So blame enters the picture instantaneously in this mess. Deceit enters. She gave me some of the fruit. It's almost as if Eve walked up to him and said, hey, I was over there by the tree and I found this fruit and it's really cool. Let's have some. And he was standing there the whole time. So he's lying, like he didn't know what was going on. And instead of being a delight to him, notice in chapter 2, he wakes up from his slumber after God takes the rib and makes Eve, and he goes, this is the one. Wow, God, this is amazing. Thank you. Animals couldn't. No, this is the one. And all of a sudden, it's not this is the one, this woman that you gave me. It's ominous, right? From delight to, wow, thanks, God, right? Chapter 2 is, thanks, God. Now it's, look what you did to me. And so this whole shift in relationship, no elation, no delight, just blame and negativity, right? Verse 16, you go through these curses, right? Man said to the woman, this woman you put here with me. The woman looks and says, the serpent deceived me. So he looks at the serpent and he says, you're going to crawl on your belly and eat dust the rest of your life. There's going to be this enmity between you and the woman and her seed. To the woman, immediately he says, so he takes from the last person who was blamed, gives them the curse, and then he works his way back out to Adam, who was the start of this whole blame game, right? To the woman in verse 16, he says, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to your children. End of verse 16, really critical. Your desire will be for your husband. And everybody goes, oh, isn't that nice? It sounds so romantic. Don't believe it. The Hebrew is not romantic at all. He will rule over you, carries the intensity of what's happening there. So the first line we go, oh, isn't that nice? They're going to be desire for each other. That's not it at all. There's going to be competition. Okay, so there's blame, there's competition that enters the scene. Your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. In other words, the language here is this language of competition, hostility, and wrestling for power. Your desire will be for your husband's place of leadership now that he is a dominant figure in this situation. And we'll talk about that dominance in a second. But competition enters it. And I've been married for 27, 28 years, right? Going on 29 this year. I'm a veteran of this thing. Most of the conflict that we see in our relationship is due to competition. I have a perspective about how something should be done. The lovely Deborah has a perspective of how something should be done, and it maybe is a little different than mine, and so then we draw lines and we decide that we are going to duke this out, which is what? Competition. We are going to compete for who is going to be right. And we're going to talk about it in a few weeks, but that is the entrance of the contract negotiations of marriage. That's not covenant relationship. That is, I'm going to try and protect myself from you, and I'm going to try and dominate you and dominate the conversation. It's a horrible way to do things, right? So sin enters, and we get you. I don't want blame for this. I'm going to blame somebody else. And now we're competing for who's in charge. They've been equal up to this point. They've been completely equal. Equal partners in the plan of God, and now they're competing for who is going to dominate the other person. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. This is the beginning of a male-dominated society right here. God did not design the male-dominated society. Humans did through their sinfulness. There was none of that prior to the fall. Nobody seeking to get the upper hand. They were equals. Neither was the ruler of the other. Now, women will live in a male-dominated world and will struggle for equality from this moment forward. Okay, this is where the struggle for equality began, right here. And men have done what? They've dominated this human societies since this time. And this is driven home in verse 20, right? Verse 20, when Adam, remember this word? Names Eve. He calls her woman to begin with. And so from the middle to the end of chapter 2, it's woman or wife. There's really no naming. When he named the animals, he gave them specific names, and it implied that he had authority over them. He did not do that with her. He did not give her a specific name until after the fall, and it implies that he has authority over her. So the authority of man over woman does not happen until after sin enters, when he names her. So this whole idea that the man is the ruler is a sinful concept in human relationships. We are supposed to be a team that works together, not in competition, and not, it's my way. Especially men, okay? We're the worst. It's my way. I have to make the decision. I have the final say in this. Ooh, wait a minute. According to what I understand from prior to the fall, the ideal and now redemptive idea of a marriage relationship is we work together as a team. And disagreements don't necessarily mean that we're hostile to each other. It's just an opportunity for us to make better, healthier decisions for the two of us going forward. But we tend to go, oh, somebody's dominating, and then we compete, and then we compete, and then we compete, and then we try to protect ourselves from each other, which is contractual thinking, not covenant thinking, and we get into this whole nightmare scenario of conflict and, warring experiences. We make funny statements in our society like, yeah, that's the wife, the wife is on the phone, it's the War Department, all those kind of crazy conflicting experiences, and the reality is that's not the ideal, because something has entered in that has driven us apart. So, prior to verse 20, Eve is wow. Post verse 20, she is no longer an equal partner. She is no longer the suitable helper. She is Eve. And it's a name that carries a constant reminder of her dignified role as life giver, right? He names her Eve because she is the giver of life. It's a beautiful thing, but it's also a reminder of the curse that God placed on her, because as the giver of life, she cannot give life unless she does it through painful labor. So there's this kind of weird mixture now all of a sudden of sin's results. Yes, she's dignified. She is the one through whom we populate the earth. It's beautiful, but on the flip side, now because of sin has entered, she is going to be dominated by men, and she is going to give birth this beautiful gift that God has given her through a painful process. So her name all of a sudden becomes, he has authority over me, and this is painful. Wow, right? Pretty rough stuff. Remember, again, that naming applies authority. He asserts authority over his wife by naming her. So this whole thing is messing up the human relationship. Relationship with God, horribly messed up. Relationships between humans, warped, distorted, messed up from the get-go. The other one is our relationship with creation and work. Creation and work. The mission before the fall was extending of God's order and rule. And that thing continues on, right? We're still supposed to extend God's order into the chaos of creation. That's why every time a person buys a piece of property to build a house, what do they do with it? They clear it. They make it into this beautiful, lush garden. There's trees, there's landscaping, there's all kinds of stuff that we do because we are just driven to take the chaos out of creation and bring order to it. It's a beautiful thing. That's how we're made, but it's under all this kind of creation work is now under all kinds of crazy different parameters. What does he say to Adam? Your work will be laborious and challenging in ways that I never intended it to be. For the woman, again, her exalted position as life giver is now accompanied by pain of agony. Well, what happens to the man and his responsibility is upended as well. Her secure, loving, delighted position as an equal partner is now overshadowed by his sinful dominance. What was natural, this sense of affection and respect and delight that they both had in each other, gone relationally. It has to be worked out and maintained through hard work. Listen, anybody that's been married probably more than a week understands that all of a sudden this is going to be hard work. It doesn't take long to realize, the ideal that I had set is not reality, and now I have to change my mind, and we have to work on this. It's a very different scenario. And for the man, bringing order to the chaos of creation is going to be done with sweat and painful effort. It was going to be delightful before. It was going to be hard work, but it was going to be delightful. Now it's going to become agonizing, and sometimes it's going to become unfulfilling. Before that, there was no unfulfilling work. I find this strange. Probably the best example I have of this is two jobs that I worked when I was in college. I worked in retail at a gas station, right? It was kind of like a convenience store, but you pumped gas back in the dark ages when they still had guys that did that. And the only way you knew you accomplished anything was when you sat down and you tallied up the number of sales you made during the day and the amount of gallons of gasoline that you sold. And there was really not much that was fulfilling about that. But I also used to work for a guy in the church that I grew up in, and we would go out and we would bale hay, right? Well, when you got done with a day's worth of baling hay, you felt like you had accomplished something, right? So you have accomplishment work prior to the fall. Afterwards, this idea that work can be unfulfilling, unsatisfying, and unpurposeful settles in. And we find that. We love the weekend. We live for the weekend. Monday, right? What is that? Well, that's a result of the fall. It really is. It's a constant battle of maintenance and decay. We're always battling decay in any kind of work that we do. And daily work becomes this constant reminder of what death and decay was unleashed through disobedience. Remember, from dust you came and to dust you will return. So here's Adam working in the dust of the ground, being reminded that, guess where I'm going someday, right? Where before that was not in his brain. All of a sudden, every day, this is where I'm going. This is futile. We're almost into the book of Ecclesiastes already, aren't we? Oh, great. Here's another day. So his daily work is this constant reminder of his mortality. The human relationship with nature, with creation, changes as well. All of a sudden, something that we were to care for as stewards, right? So we started out as stewards of creation. In other words, we understood that creation belonged to God, not us. We were just here to manage it and to extend God's purposes in it. So when humans, if Adam and Eve had not fallen in the garden, they would have gone out with their offspring into nature and they would have managed it and brought order to it so that God was pleased with them and with his creation. Okay? So God could go, oh, very good. Now, all of a sudden, this is open to the possibility of exploitation. We can use it for our own benefit, and we don't have to regard how we manage it because it belongs to us now. Because what? I'm like God. Ooh, oh my goodness. All of a sudden, I've got the knowledge of good and evil, so I'm like God, and I can do whatever I want with His creation. Now, I understand. Just let me back up here. There is a huge difference between reasonable care of creation and the idolatry thereof. Right? We have an entire segment of our population that is idolatrous of creation to the point of almost craziness sometimes. I get that. But on the flip side of that, we also idolize our exploitation of creation and our ability to use it as we see fit. And so we have to say what? Well, God has given us these things to provide for ourselves food, clothing, shelter, and a living, but we also are responsible to make sure that it's taken well care of. So, listen, I have no problem with somebody opening up a mine and mining minerals out of the earth so that I can have the car that I drive. But I want them to be responsible that when their mine runs dry, that they bring it back to some sort of usable natural state that doesn't kill human beings and the life around it. Okay? I love the fact that I can go up to Merriman and I can fish in the mine ponds and not worry about whether I'm going to get mercury poisoning from the fish that are in the ponds that were the settling ponds from the iron mine that was there, right? Because people are now required to put things back to their prior condition. Anybody here a fan of the gold mining operation television shows at all? Yeah, right, Gold Rush. Okay, so I love it when they go back and they show these kind of, okay, this guy mined here for 5 years and mined all the gold out of this one tract, but then they go back and realize that they've had to save, I think the one guy had to save, $300,000 of his gold mining profits to make sure that he put the land back to some sort of livable, manageable, pure water condition. What is that? Well, that's not exploiting, that's stewarding what God has given us. Right? It makes a lot of sense to do that. So our relationship with nature changed because now in sin we can exploit it for our own benefit. And that's kind of a scary idea. We do it all the time. There were places outside of Detroit when the auto industry was at its peak that entire rivers were filled with industrial waste and they would burn. The waters would burn. That is exploitation in its worst scenario, okay? So we have to make sure that we do not damage what God has given us. So what went wrong? Obviously, the fall into sin unleashed this whole damaging storm of negative effects on human relationships, relationship with God, relationship with nature, relationship with each other. We act competitively. We compete for domination. This is one of the reasons that it's so difficult to have a healthy marriage, because we're competing for who's in charge. Kind of the who wears the pants, and we're trying to determine who does that. And we're constantly at each other. We wrestle for control, and our purpose is frustrated by the landmines of sinfulness. When we should be working together toward this mutual goal of honoring God, we're working against each other, trying to do what we can do to get our desires. So the effects of the fall upended this life that God intended for us. And so what is our goal now is to, how can we reconcile, how can we redeem the intent of God from Genesis 1 and 2 and have better relationships, have a better life to live in? How can we flourish around this? I mean, every one of us is broken. Every one of us has damage. We have to look for ways that we can make sure that we are getting rid of the chaos of our damaged selves and helping each other become the best person that we can possibly be. So like if you just take my marriage, my goal in my marriage is not to get the most that I can get for Dave. My goal is to help make sure that my wife becomes the best person she can possibly be in the restoration of the image of God in her, and her job is to help me become the best person that I can possibly be and restore as much as possible the image of God in me. That's how human relationships are supposed to work. But we know they don't. We get damaged, and we damage each other. And we need to begin to work through this and go, wow, God had this wonderful intent. How can we work toward that intent? How can we work out the best for the other person? Just some questions that might help. I think they're in the note sheet. What does redemption look like in a relational conflict? When we're at conflict, because humans do that, how do we bring redemption to it? How can I resist the temptation to dominate other people in my life? How can I selflessly serve those in my household in specific? In what ways are we deviating from accepting what God says and live by? Okay, so there's this whole fear of God thing. How can we get back on track? And what can I do to demonstrate care and stewardship of God's very good creation as a person who lives here, so that I'm not damaging what God has given me to care for? And so those are some things that we just need to think about, because we're going to, how do we put this back together? How do we restore relationships and develop the healthiest relationships that we possibly can? And we'll look at that in the next several weeks.